The final signature dried, a faint scratch of ink sealing a 15-year-old wound. From my Seattle office, I watched the confirmation email land. "It's done," my COO's voice crackled through the speaker. "Vanguard Tech is officially ours." Vanguard. The name tasted like ash and stale coffee. The ghost of a termination letter in my hand. They called me timid, passive, unfit to lead. Now Mark and Richard, the very men who shoved me out the door with a pathetic severance check, were about to learn what a timid man could do. Their first meeting as my new employees was in 1 hour. And I had the agenda right here. It was a single, typed word: consequences. The door to the conference room hissed open. Mark stormed in first, a walking cliché of faded corporate bravado. 15 years had softened his jawline and thinned his hair. But the same predatory smile was stretched across his face. "Elliot, good to see you," he boomed, extending a hand. "We are thrilled to talk synergy." Behind him, Richard followed like a shadow. He was always the snake in the boardroom, quieter, more venomous. His suit was a size too tight now, his gaze flicking around my office, calculating angles, assessing threats. He offered only a curt nod. "Vance." I ignored Mark's outstretched hand. I let the silence hang in the air, a heavy, suffocating blanket. I simply gestured to the 2 chairs opposite me, separated by an ocean of polished mahogany. "Sit," I said. My voice was quiet, but it echoed with the weight of a decade and a half of planning. They exchanged a nervous glance. The bravado evaporated from Mark's face, replaced by a flicker of confusion, a hint of fear. They sat. The trap was set. And they had just walked right into it. I leaned back, the leather of my chair groaning softly. I let the silence stretch, watching them squirm. Mark cleared his throat. Richard adjusted his tie. It was the same nervous gesture he'd made 15 years ago, just before they destroyed my career. The memory was so vivid it felt like yesterday. I was a senior analyst at Vanguard, head of the data team for the Odyssey project. It was their flagship venture, a predictive analytics platform they'd sunk millions into. And it was built on a fatal flaw. I found it buried deep in the source code, a cascading error in the algorithm that would corrupt the entire dataset within 6 months of launch. I brought it to them. I remember the sterile white walls of that old conference room, the scent of burnt coffee. I had charts, projections, irrefutable proof. I laid it all out. Mark had laughed, a dismissive, patronizing sound. "Elliot, we're not paying you to be a doomsayer. We need confidence, action." Richard had been quieter, his words like surgical cuts. "This is a leadership test, Elliot. Sometimes you have to push through the noise. Your hesitation is concerning." I stood my ground. "This isn't hesitation," I argued, my voice tight. "It's certainty. The platform will fail." They saw caution and called it cowardice. They saw careful analysis and called it paralysis. They launched the Odyssey project against my explicit, documented warnings. 6 months later, to the day, it imploded. The data corruption was catastrophic. Clients fled. The stock plummeted. It nearly sank the company. 2 days after that, they called me into Mark's office, the same office I'd just acquired. They didn't look me in the eye. "Your lack of conviction created a negative feedback loop in the team," Mark said, reading from a script. "Your timid approach was a drag on morale and, ultimately, a contributing factor to the project's failure." Richard added, the final twist of the knife. "We need leaders, Elliot, not followers. This isn't a good fit." They handed me a box from my desk and a severance check that was an insult. As I walked out of that building, past the panicked faces of my former colleagues, I didn't feel despair. I felt a cold, clarifying rage. It wasn't just a firing. It was a character assassination. They hadn't just made me a scapegoat. They had branded me with a weakness I never possessed. That day I made a silent promise. One day they would work for me, and they would learn the difference between timidity and patience. Now, looking at them across my desk, that day had finally come. The patience had run out. I slid a single, pristine file folder across the vast mahogany expanse. It stopped perfectly between them. "This," I began, my voice a low hum of stored thunder, "is your performance review." Richard's long fingers reached for the folder, but Mark, ever the front man, slapped his hand down on it. He forced a laugh that sounded like grinding gears. "A performance review? Elliot, come on, we're partners now. Let's talk about the future, not HR paperwork." "This not is the future," I said, my voice cutting through his false bonhomie. "Yours, specifically. Open it." Mark's smile faltered. He flipped open the cover. His face went slack. Richard leaned over, his sharp features tightening into a mask of disbelief. Inside wasn't a review. It was a single, pristine copy of the internal memo I'd sent them 15 years ago. The one titled, "Odyssey Project. Critical Algorithm Failure Warning." My signature was at the bottom. Dated, stapled behind it were the damning headlines from the weeks that followed the launch. Vanguard stock plummets. Odyssey failure costs investors billions. And tucked neatly behind those was our final acquisition agreement. A perfect 15-year timeline of their incompetence, authored by their own arrogance. "You saw this coming," Richard whispered, his voice raspy. He wasn't asking. "I didn't just see it coming," I replied, leaning forward. "I counted on it. The day you fired me, you didn't just create a rival. You created your most dedicated data point." I tapped a finger on the mahogany desk. "For 15 years, Apex has been tracking your every move. Every reckless product launch, every over-leveraged expansion, every desperate attempt to recapture the glory you threw away. You called my analysis hesitation. I called it building a predictive model. And the model's primary variable was you." Mark slammed the folder shut. "This is a vendetta. You bought a multi-million-dollar company over a 15-year-old grudge?" "Don't flatter yourself, Mark. This wasn't about a grudge. This was a sound business decision. A company run by two men who consistently prioritize ego over evidence is a fundamentally predictable and ultimately vulnerable asset. You were my Odyssey project. And unlike yours, my platform didn't fail." I stood and walked to the window overlooking the Seattle skyline. "So, here is your review. Effective immediately, you are both being reassigned." A flicker of relief crossed their faces. They thought this was just a corporate reshuffle, a golden parachute. "You won't be fired," I continued, turning back to face them. "That would be an insult to the process. Instead, you'll be leading a new special projects division. Your sole mandate will be to personally oversee the final decommissioning of all legacy systems related to the Odyssey project. You will document every failure, interview every engineer from the original team who is still here, and write a final comprehensive post-mortem report detailing exactly why it collapsed." The color was gone from their faces. They understood this wasn't a job, it was a prison sentence served in the graveyard of their own making. "I'm calling it Project Atonement," I said, letting the words hang in the air. "You once told me you needed leaders, not followers. Well, here's your chance to lead. Lead the cleanup crew. Your severance, if any, will be determined by the quality and honesty of your final report." I walked to the door and paused, my hand on the handle. "Your new office is in the sub-basement, right next to the archives. I believe you know the way. After all, it's where you sent me to pack my box." I watched them, expecting the explosion. I had spent 15 years imagining this moment, and in every version, Mark's face turned purple as he roared, throwing chairs and threatening lawsuits. I pictured Richard's quiet venom, finally boiling over into hissed threats. I was braced for the storm. It never came. The silence that followed was different, not the heavy, suffocating kind I had imposed earlier. but a brittle, crystalline quiet, threatening to shatter. Mark's jaw worked, his knuckles white where he gripped the edge of the mahogany desk. He looked like a man drowning, his lungs full of water, unable to make a sound. It was Richard who broke the spell. He rose slowly, with a fluid grace that was almost unnerving. He smoothed the front of his too-tight suit jacket, a meticulous, almost robotic gesture. He didn't look at me. He looked at Mark, and, with a barely perceptible shake of his head, he silenced the eruption before it could begin. Then, his gaze met mine. His eyes were flat, reptilian. All the panic and disbelief had been compressed into two tiny, hard points of pure, distilled hatred. "A post-mortem," Richard said, his voice a dry rustle of leaves. It was devoid of emotion, which made it infinitely more chilling than any shout. "Of course! A very thorough directive, Elliot." He picked up the folder from the table. He didn't look inside it again, he held it as if it were a dead thing. He turned to Mark, who was still frozen in his chair. "Come on, Mark," Richard said, his tone as soft as a blade. "We have a project to lead." Mark flinched as if struck. He looked from Richard's placid face to my own, searching for a crack, an opening, a sign this was some monstrous negotiation tactic. He found none. He pushed himself to his feet, his movements clumsy, his bravado utterly gone. He was a puppet whose strings had been cut. They didn't plead, they didn't bargain, they didn't even rage. They simply walked toward the door, Richard in the lead, Mark trailing like a ghost in his wake. As Richard passed me, he paused for a fraction of a second. "You always were good with data," he whispered, so quietly it was almost lost in the hiss of the door. "But you've made one miscalculation. You think this is an ending." Then they were gone. The door clicked shut, sealing me inside my victory. The silence that returned was absolute. I had won. I had achieved the goal that had fueled me for a decade and a half. I had brought my tormentors to their knees. But their calm acceptance was not the surrender I had craved. It was an acknowledgement of a new set of rules. I had wanted to see them broken. Instead, I saw them adapt. The timid man had finally bared his teeth, and in response, the snakes had simply shed their skin. I stood at the window for a long time after they left, watching the Seattle rain begin to streak the glass, blurring the city into a watercolor of gray and steel. The victory was a low hum in my veins, a frequency I'd tuned my entire life to for 15 years. But Richard's final words were a discordant note, a piece of rogue data that didn't fit the model. "Nice. You think this is an ending." He was right. I had miscalculated. I had planned for every financial contingency, every operational hurdle, every legal challenge. I had modeled their greed, their arrogance, their inevitable decline. But I had not modeled this, their quiet reptilian compliance. I had expected a brawl. They had offered a bow. It was wrong. My fingers flew across the keyboard. I pulled up the internal security feeds. I found them. Sub-basement archive sector B. The room was exactly as I remembered it. Cinderblock walls, flickering fluorescent lights, the smell of dust and decay seeping through the ventilation. 2 cheap metal desks had been installed, facing a wall of stacked, forgotten document boxes. Mark was pacing the small space like a caged animal, his face flushed, his hands clenching and unclenching. He kicked a box, sending a plume of dust into the air. "A post-mortem! He wants us to dig our own graves and write an epitaph. I'll sue him into the ground. I'll call Jennings at the Journal. You'll do nothing." Richard's voice cut through the tirade. He was sitting perfectly still at his desk, the file I had given them placed squarely in front of him. He hadn't opened it again. He was looking at the cinderblock wall as if it were a chessboard. "You'll do nothing but the job he's given us." "Are you insane?" Mark sputtered. "This is humiliation." "He's putting us in the cellar." "He is," Richard agreed, his voice dangerously calm. "And in doing so, he has made his first critical error. Think, Mark. For once, stop bellowing and think. What is our mandate? Mark stopped pacing. To write a report on the Odyssey failure. To do that, Richard continued, turning his head slowly to face his partner, a predator's smile touching his lips for the first time. We must interview every original engineer. We must access every department file. We must speak to every senior manager still here, from that era. He has given us a corporate keycard and a legitimate, documented reason to speak with every single influential person from the old Vanguard Guard. The realization dawned on Mark's face, chasing away the anger. He thinks he's forcing us to confess our sins, Richard murmured, tapping a finger on the file. But what he's actually done is given us a platform, a chance to frame the narrative. We won't be writing a story of our failure. We will be writing the story of a brilliant project sabotaged by a timid, data-obsessed analyst who couldn't see the big picture. A man who, 15 years later, is still so consumed by that failure that he bought an entire company just to settle a score. Who do you think our people will rally behind? The cold-blooded tyrant in the penthouse, or the humbled leaders in the trenches trying to set the record straight? My blood ran cold. He was turning my weapon back on me. This wasn't a prison, it was a command center. The next morning, I walked into the integration briefing with my COO, Maria. She was brilliant, pragmatic, the only person I'd ever told the full story. A large whiteboard was covered in org charts and timelines. The Vanguard leadership team is shell-shocked, she said, tapping a red marker on a box labeled Senior Engineering. They don't know what to think. Your move with Mark and Richard, it's causing tremors. They're terrified of a purge. There will be no purge, I said firmly. This was personal. The rest is business. We need their talent. I want you to schedule an all-hands meeting for Friday. I'll address everyone myself. I'll lay out the vision, assure them of their value. Maria hesitated, a frown line creasing her forehead. Elliot, is this Project Atonement wise? You've made your point. Forcing them to do this in the sub-basement feels vindictive. It sends a message to the rest of the company that this acquisition is about punishment, not progress. It's about accountability, I countered, my voice sharper than I intended. They need to understand the foundation of this company is data, not ego. This is the first lesson. You're teaching a lesson to 2 men, she said quietly. But you're giving a lecture to 500 employees. Be careful they're hearing the message you intend. Her words lingered as I returned to my office. An urgent email was waiting, forwarded from the new head of Vanguard's R&D, a man named David Chen. The subject line was blank. The body of the email contained only a forwarded message, one that had been circulating among the senior Vanguard managers. It was anonymous. Team, *5As. We navigate this transition. Many of you have expressed concern about the new leadership's priorities. I can now confirm that Apex's first official directive for our former executives, Mark and Richard, is a special project located in the sub-basement archives. They are being forced to write a report on a project that failed 15 years ago. While we must all comply with new directives, it's important we understand the motivation here. This is not about synergy. This is not about future growth. This is an old grudge being settled on company time. Times, be cautious. The focus right now is on the past, not the future. Protect your teams. Document everything. We are in uncharted territory. The message was a masterpiece of corporate poison. It was deniable, untraceable, and devastatingly effective. It painted me as a petty, backward-looking monster. It positioned Mark and Richard not as failures being held to account, but as martyrs. It sowed fear and mistrust with surgical precision. I leaned back in my chair, the hum of victory gone, replaced by the screech of a warning siren. Richard hadn't just shed his skin, he had planted his fangs in the heart of my new company, injecting a venom I had no immediate antidote for. My predictive model, the one that had flawlessly charted their downfall for a decade and a half, was now obsolete. It had been built on business data, on market trends and quarterly reports, I had failed to properly weigh the most unpredictable variable of all: human nature, the variable I had dismissed as noise. I stared at the anonymous email on my screen, a ghost-written declaration of war. Richard wasn't just defending, he was colonizing the minds of my new employees. My meticulously planned revenge, my Project Atonement, had become his recruitment drive. He was building an insurgency in my own sub-basement, using my own directive as a shield. Maria came in, holding a tablet with the talking points for the Friday all-hands meeting. "We should get ahead of this, Elliot. Address the rumors head-on." "No," I said, closing the laptop. "Cancel the meeting." "Cancel it? Elliot, that will create a vacuum. Their narrative will become the only one." "Let it," I said, standing up. "Let Richard think he's winning the information war. He's broadcasting on one frequency. I'm about to change the channel entirely." I left her standing there and went straight to the digital archives. Not the dusty cellar where I'd imprisoned them, but the secure HR servers. As the new owner, I had the master key. I wasn't interested in Richard's personnel file or Mark's performance reviews. I typed in a project code that hadn't been active in 15 years, Odyssey. A list of names populated the screen. The original team. My team. I scanned the list, my heart a dull, painful drum. I saw the names of engineers who were quietly let go in the months after the collapse. Analysts reassigned to dead-end projects. I found what Richard and Mark had done after I was gone. It wasn't just a cover-up, it was a purge. They had systematically dismantled the team, scattering anyone who knew the truth to the wind. But not everyone. A few names had a green dot next to them. Still active employees. My finger hovered over one name: Sarah Jenkins. She was a junior coder then, brilliant and meticulous. She'd been the first one to replicate my findings on the algorithm flaw. According to the server, she was now a senior systems architect, buried 3 levels deep in legacy maintenance. They hadn't fired her. They had just made sure she'd never be in a position to question authority again. I picked up my phone. She answered on the second ring, her voice wary. "This is Sarah." "Sarah, this is Elliot Vance." The silence on the other end was a physical thing. I could hear her sharp intake of breath. "Mr. Vance, I saw the acquisition news. Congratulations." "Thank you. I'm calling about the Odyssey project." The caution in her voice hardened into a wall of ice. "That was a long time ago." "I know," I said softly. "I also know they made you sign an NDA after they fired me. I know they threatened the rest of the team with legal action if anyone corroborated my report. I'm calling to tell you that as of this morning, that NDA is null and void. Apex Strategic Analytics officially waives it." Another silence, longer this time. I could hear the faint, frantic clicking of a keyboard in the background. She was checking, verifying. I waited. "Why?" She finally whispered, her voice tight with 15 years of suppressed anger. "Why now?" "Because," I said, my own voice steady and clear, "the final chapter of the Odyssey post-mortem is about to be written. And this time, it will be written by the people who were telling the truth. They have the original files," she said, the words tumbling out now. "Richard has been requesting them. He's going to twist it, just like he did before. He'll say you were the problem." "Let him," I said. "He can have the files. You have something he can never access." "What? Your memory, your notes, your truth." I paused. "Sarah, on Friday, I'm holding an all-hands meeting. I'm not going to be the only one speaking. I'm reactivating Project Odyssey. Not to relitigate, but to restore. To build our future on a foundation of truth, not a convenient lie. The floor will be open to any member of the original team who wants to speak." The dam broke. I heard a choked sob on the other end of the line. "They told us we were wrong," she said, her voice cracking. "They told us we were disloyal for even listening to you." You weren't wrong, I said. You were just early. After I hung up, I sent a single, company-wide email. The subject line was simple: Gnomes matter, an invitation. The body was even simpler. The all-hands meeting on Friday will now be at Town Hall. The topic: the Odyssey Project. We will hear directly from the engineers and analysts of the original team. Their voices have been silent for 15 years. It's time for us to listen. Full project archives, including all original memos and performance reviews, will be declassified and made available to all employees an hour before the meeting. Let the data speak for itself. I hit send. It was done. Richard thought he was writing a narrative. The auditorium was cavernous, yet utterly silent. 500 employees stared at their tablets and phones, the same documents glowing on every screen. My warning memo. Richard's dismissive email reply. The team-wide gag order. An hour before the meeting, I had given them the raw data. Now the air crackled with the friction of a 15-year-old lie grinding against the unyielding truth. Mark and Richard sat in the front row, a condition of their employment. They were cornered animals, bathed in the projector's cold light. They looked like ghosts at their own funeral. I stepped to the podium. I won't be speaking much today, I began, my voice amplified in the charged silence. Instead, we're going to hear from the people who were there. First, I'd like to welcome Sarah Jenkins, Senior Systems Architect. Sarah walked to the microphone, her steps hesitant. For a moment she just stood there looking out at the sea of faces, then she took a deep breath. He told them, she said, her voice trembling but clear. Elliot Vance told them the platform would fail. I saw his data. I replicated his findings. We all knew. Behind her, my original memo appeared on the giant screen, its title a stark indictment, Critical Algorithm Failure Warning. They didn't just ignore him. Sarah's voice grew stronger, fueled by years of silence. They threatened us. They told us our careers would be over if we backed him up. They chose the lie because the truth was inconvenient. A low murmur swept through the room. It wasn't anger. It was the sound of gears clicking into place, of 1,000 individual realizations aligning into one undeniable conclusion. I saw a veteran engineer nod slowly. A young project manager just shook her head in disbelief. Mark had shrunk in his chair, his face ashen, staring at his own shoes. Richard, however, was perfectly still. He stared directly at me, his face a blank mask, but his eyes burned with an intensity that could melt steel. Another engineer from the Odyssey team followed Sarah. Then another. It was a cascade, an avalanche of testimony that buried the lie for good. Finally, Richard stood. He didn't say a word. He simply smoothed his jacket, turned with a chillingly deliberate calm, and walked up the aisle. Every eye followed him. He didn't look back, not even when the heavy auditorium door clicked shut behind him, a sound as final as a gavel strike. He had conceded the war for the narrative. Mark didn't move. He was just a man left behind in the ruins. Tell me in the comments, what's the very first thing you would do on day one as the new boss of the people who said you'd never succeed?